por expertos en distintas ramas de la educación. Tenemos la obligación como seres humanos de hacernos. Yo los invito a que nos hagamos constantemente. El derrotero, en última instancia, sería tal vez la felicidad. Eduquémonos para ser felices. Estemos abiertos al cambio, a las distintas perspectivas, a los distintos criterios. Y eso es precisamente lo que hemos palpado en este tipo de reuniones. Muchas gracias por su atención. El doctor Rodolfo Rincones, presidente del Consorcio Internacional, con ustedes.
Buenos días, espero que estén un poco despiertos después de la gran fiesta de anoche. Parece que la pasaron muy bien, pero esta mañana tenemos a nuestro tercer conferencista magistral de esta conferencia, y es para mí un gran honor y un placer presentarlo, tenerlo de invitado en este día con nosotros. Es una gran responsabilidad también presentar a una persona de tan alta investidura y calibre académico. El doctor Henry Trueba es, para no leer sus grandes logros académicos y administrativos que lo pondrían como en una torre de marfil, quisiera referirme un poco, después de conocerlo ya por varios años, desde que por ahí andaba yo estudiando mi doctorado, referirme a él en su calidad humana, en su aspecto humano, y luego leerles lo que ya está en el programa, ¿no? que es algo de sus logros académicos y administrativos. Henry me mandó un currículum vitae como de 30 páginas, dificilísimo de resumir en lo que ustedes ven ahí en el programa, entonces sería difícil hacerlo, ¿no? Pero quisiera referirme más que nada a este aspecto humano, que según lo entiendo, ¿no? Y ustedes estarán de acuerdo conmigo cuando lo escuchen después de su presentación. Veo en él que hay una gran intensidad, una gran dedicación, una gran honestidad hacia la educación de todos, pero sobre todo de los niños que más lo necesitan. Cuando hablo con él y se refiere conmigo a los niños de las favelas de Brasil, a los niños de Bosnia y a los 30 millones de migrantes que se encuentran por todo el mundo, no puedo pensar en otra cosa más que en la gran calidad humana de esta persona. Cuando se refiere a los indocumentados de California y de Texas, cuando se refiere a las personas que se encuentran, a los trabajadores agrícolas de Wisconsin, no me queda pensar más que es una persona completamente dedicada y procura entender estos fenómenos de estas personas. Y es ahí en donde creo yo puede uno encontrar la explicación de todo el trabajo profesional que ha hecho Henry por una gran carrera que ahora tiene, que por cierto, con la visita del Paso, ahora él inicia su año sabático de la Universidad de Houston, en donde ha sido por el último año vicepresidente de Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost en la Universidad de Houston. Anteriormente a esto, a Henry fue el decano del Colegio de Educación de la Universidad de Wisconsin en Madison, considerado como una de las mejores, si no es que la mejor escuela, el colegio de educación en Estados Unidos y por lo tanto en el mundo. Henry, como podrán ver por ahí, ha recorrido Estados Unidos y el mundo en cuestiones académicas y de investigación. Anteriormente a esto estuvo en la Universidad de Davis, donde fue director de la División de Educación en la Universidad de California en Davis. Ha sido profesor en diversas universidades, en Urbana-Champaign, en Santa Bárbara, en la Universidad de San Diego State University. Su lista de publicaciones es tan intensa que les digo, cubre aproximadamente 14, 15 páginas, que sería innecesario mencionarlas ahí, pero si ustedes se dedican a la educación bilingüe, a la educación multicultural, a la educación de minorías, por ahí se cruzarán con sus lecturas y muy seguramente tendrán que leerlas en algunos de sus cursos. Tiene un sinnúmero de libros, yo conté aproximadamente 18 libros publicados, editados por él. Entre los dos últimos, puedo aquí referirme a dos de ellos. Uno de ellos está en el programa y se titula Ethnic Identity and Power, Cultural Context of Political Action in School and Society. Otro que no está aquí mencionado, pero también publicado por la misma compañía editora y que ha tenido bastante éxito en el medio de educación, es Spanish for Spanish Speakers in the U.S. Language and Cultural Rights. Como verán, el trabajo de Henry no nada más recoge los aspectos técnicos y pedagógicos de la educación bilingüe multicultural, sino que trata de recogerlos en un ambiente contextual y politizarlos. Henry es un trotamundos, acaba de regresar de China, en donde ha recibido varias condecoraciones por varias universidades varias escuelas normales de China. Ha hecho bastante investigación en este país, así como en México. Henry es un buen conocedor de México, y si alguien tiene alguna pregunta sobre Chiapas, Henry creo que también la puede contestar. Como les digo, es difícil hablar de Henry en su aspecto profesional sin que se le olvide o se le escape uno a algo. Es por eso que quise iniciar refiriéndome a él como un amigo, como una persona que conozco en su aspecto humano, con su calidad humana. Es un gran entendedor de Paulo Freire, quien es un educador brasileño con bastante impacto entre los educadores en todo el mundo. Hoy el título de su presentación es Crisis in Education of Crisis in Education of Binational. You see, I'm trying to switch languages here. Crisis in the Education of Binational Children, Prejudice, Pseudoscience, and Myopia in Higher Education. And just by the title, we'll hear what he has to say about it. And I think it's going to be an exciting one. I hope you enjoy it. And let me welcome a good friend of ours, and let's welcome Henry Trueba.
Rodolfo, muchas gracias. Oye, no quiero desilusionarlos ya que entre la plática, porque dicen tantas cosas que a lo mejor no sale cierto nada de eso, ¿eh? Pero muchas gracias, Rodolfo, como un amigo se aprecia esto. Me siento un poco deshabilitado porque estudié toda mi carrera en inglés desde 1962 y muchas de las cosas que voy a decir no las puedo decir en español, pero de vez en cuando me voy a bajar al español para ver las caras, a ver si vamos siguiendo la misma pista o no. Creo que el micrófono está muy cerca y me va a atacar aquí, vamos a bajar un poquito. Ok, así está mejor. ¿Me oyen allá atrás? Ok, gracias. Mire, cuando este libro de Freire, Pedagogía de la Esperanza, se acababa de publicar en portugués, llegué a la casa de Freire, y esto hace poco, hace como un año y unos meses. Él había venido al hospital y le empecé a preguntar en qué sentido la pedagogía de la esperanza tenía algo que ver para complementar el pensamiento de la pedagogía de los oprimidos. Y él me dijo, lea la introducción. Y en la introducción, o el otro micrófono también, ok. ¿Ahí está mejor? Ok. Y en la introducción, Paulo Freire tiene esta frase, dice, la esperanza es una necesidad ontológica. Si existimos tenemos que tener esperanza, dice. La desesperanza, la falta de esperanza, es una esperanza que perdió su dirección y en distorsión se convirtió en nada. No pudo llegar a realizarse como esperanza. Y luego más abajo dice, mi esperanza es necesaria, pero no es suficiente. Y empieza a decir cómo los maestros y muchas gentes no pueden nada más llevar esa esperanza y esperar que con esa esperanza todo el mundo vaya a cambiar. I want to make sure that when I talk to you about crisis in the education of binational children, when I talk to you about prejudice and pseudoscience and myopia, that you don't in any way believe that I have lost hope. I do not wonder that some children from Mexican origin have problems in education. What I wonder is that in spite of all the things we have done to them, in spite of almost forcing them to lose their language and culture and their identity, that so many of them do so well. So I definitely believe that while these crises are serious, in no way weaken my confidence in children. Their survival skills, their talents, their resourcefulness is a testimony in every study I have conducted. And I tell you that I do have a lot of skepticism about higher education in the US. But in spite of that, I can tell you the leadership that is moving up in the hands of Latino intellectuals is the hope of the future of the education of the largest and fastest growing group in America, which is Hispanic kids. Let me go back to the issue of crisis. What is a psychological crisis versus a social crisis? Well, first of all, a crisis like Proposition 187 in California is both. And I would take a little bit of time to elaborate about it, but just the attempt to cut children from their education, the attempt to cut all immigrants, documented and undocumented, from social services, from medical services, from their mental sanity, and these continuous kinds of assails, these continuous kinds of challenges, all of that to me is a crisis in the US. Not an isolated crisis. I would like to give you a little bit of a context about it in the next few minutes. The attempt to reinforce stereotypes about all immigrants, particularly immigrants of color, all the way even at the federal level, to depict them, to paint them as parasites, as individuals that are costing too much and wasting tax monies, to generalize the lack of support for teachers working with language minority students, to try to persuade them that you ignore the language and culture of children, you eventually will help them survive and go over the problems. All of those things to me are a crisis in a very sullen, in a very unhuman kind of approaching the next generation. And I'm hoping that groups like these, the intellectuals that have lived through the experience of having to deal in the binational setting, they can help revive the responsibility and the commitment of educators on both sides of the border to respect the children, to give them the support they need. It seems that in the face of this so-called crisis, in the US, university faculty, researchers, and administrators have reacted with indifference. It's very sad to see that. Have reacted with myopia. They don't care. They have tolerated public prejudice. They have tolerated the pseudoscience of testing, a business that goes up to about $375 million a year. They have justified the unwarranted interpretation of tests, regardless of language and culture differences. And that way, they have created still the basis for more prejudice. So in that cycle of tolerance and intolerance in the history of the US that has been going up and down since we know, we are reaching another height. You remember in the 1920s when people were being put in jail because they spoke a foreign language, including Spanish, which was considered to be a sign of turpitude, a sign of being morally wrong. We get into the point that even to discuss the language and cultural rights of children is looked upon as unpatriotic. In the face of that indifference of many American universities, I think the time has come for us to play some leadership roles, and to take over the efforts to provide the next generation with the love and affection, the support and respect they deserve. In many universities in the last few days, as a matter of fact, they're dropping out not just affirmative action in the traditional sense, they're dropping out equity efforts on the grounds that they are close to an affirmative action, on the wrong assumption that affirmative action presupposes racial or other inferiority of ethnic groups, when the main effort of affirmative action was to create opportunities taken away from people, opportunities that people deserve, particularly people of color. In the last few months, many ethnic faculty themselves, African Americans, Latinos, have become divided philosophically on issues of equity. And many times they have sided with the administration against equity rights of women and minorities for the sake of winning the favor of the administration. Many of the education psychologists have decided to ignore the serious problems in interpreting the results of tests, those subscribing to the traditional kinds of results that essentially assume that you score lowly in certain kinds of psychometric tests. You must be intellectually inferior, you don't have the capacity, which is a total nonsense. The example last century is in 1875, when different ethnic groups had different quotas of admission in this country, according to their test scores, that has come today to be in the form of taking children into schools and allow them mainstream activities on the basis of the performance in tests they never took and they never understood, that don't mean a darn thing. This is a situation, this is the crossroads in which we find ourselves. There has been a great deal of discourse and discussion about these matters. There is a lot of work in the larger international context about prejudice, and yet we don't seem to be able to grasp our responsibility, the responsibility we have on both sides of the border for the next generation of our national children. Permítame dar un sumario, un resumen muy rápido. En realidad lo que está pasando en Estados Unidos es que mucha gente ha abandonado su responsabilidad intelectual, su responsabilidad moral de dar oportunidad a los niños de habla hispana o de otras lenguas, que se ha permitido que se usen el tipo de instrumentos de test que ya sabe uno que van a dar resultados siempre los mismos. La gente que no habla el inglés va a ser prejuiciada en contra. Que se ha usado una forma indirecta de dar apoyo a las políticas nacionales de indiferencia y que en realidad al tomar esa posesión las universidades han abandonado su papel de líderes intelectuales. Allí nos hallamos. Let me provide you with an international context of these kinds of phenomenon outside of the U.S. so you don't feel that this has happened only in the U.S. or in the border areas. First of all, the cycles of oppression and intolerance that have affected the entire human race are intimately related to the whole issue of ethnic struggles over centuries and the attempts to exterminate groups, the genocide efforts. They have not occurred overnight. We, of course, we get dramatically impressed with the Holocaust and say, how could that happen? When you look at the history, what was going on in Illinois at the time, look at the tolerance of Nazi's policies, look at the enormous support within the government to some of those policies that essentially looked at some human beings as indifferent. And go back in history and look, for example, the kind of policies that affected even the movement of European groups into this hemisphere. La falta de tolerancia, los ciclos de intolerancia, es un fenómeno histórico, ¿no? Los españoles, por ejemplo, se llevaron a la Nueva España todas sus taxonomías de castas y de razas para poder excluir a ciertos indígenas de carreras, por ejemplo, a sacerdotes, etc. Y en realidad, muchos de los crímenes cometidos contra la gente, los indígenas en México, particularmente en los 2 primeros siglos, indicaban esa filosofía semejante. The wonder is that is happening today in the U.S. Prejudice against racial, ethnic, or religious groups is paving the way to destruction of those groups, not just in Bosnia and Herzegovina and so on, but all over. The ongoing migrations and immigrations worldwide are caused by serious political and economic crisis, and it's increasing, and not only in European countries. The issue is that the intolerance of non-Europeans, for example, in Europe, is now politically sanctioned. There are parties in Belgium, in France, and Germany that get anywhere between 25 and 50% of the votes on anti-immigrant basis, demanding the exiling of all of those people that are not European. These are active, politically organized kinds of groups. And of course, we cannot just forget that that is happening in the Asian countries. You know that Japan has a very poor record. Japan had autochthonous groups, the Burakumin, for example, that were considered subhuman. They were born there, they were natives. All of the immigrant groups in Japan, particularly Korean immigrants and others, were considered subhuman. Not until a few years, 10, 12 years, they were allowed to come to schools with the rest of the people. They kept taxonomies and they kept genealogies to prevent intermarriages between, say, Korean, Japanese, and Japanese, etc. To make this worse, they essentially, particularly towards the end of the Second World War, they showed how they could have used some of the other populations in the Pacific. And there's all kinds of testimony about experimentation the Japanese conducted in those countries. And today is a very serious problem. So some of the Japanese immigrants or these low-income groups to participate in mainstream Japan. Does that happen in China? Of course it does. China has 1.2 billion people. 92 million of them are minorities, 8% of them, in spite of the fact that 8% of the Chinese minorities, of the Chinese who are minorities, control 64% of the land. Their income is the lowest, and they're still exploited. 3 of the major groups, for example, the Muslim Chinese, they lost their language. They were forced to lose their language. They retain the culture, they retain the religion, and these people still today are organized a structure to resist pretty much the way that the Jewish people do in the US and in Europe. The people I work with, the Miao, who are the ancestors of the Hmong people in the US, they're about 7.5 million in central South China. They have the largest illiteracy rates, about 96% of them don't read or write, understand. They have the lowest income, $34 a year for the family, medium income. And I could tell you, example after example, the oppression of the 50-some ethnic groups in China, in spite of the efforts of Mao Zedong and others, since 1949. The oppression is going on today. But in spite of that, the efforts in China are unique, and I put myself on note because that is a major exception. The universities in China, particularly those for ethnic minorities, they're doing an outstanding job. They provide entire support for people to go to university, to learn there, to get the degrees, and then provide work for life. And a few days ago, the president of the Central University of Nationalities in Beijing came to visit us. And one of the things he mentioned that I didn't know is that the responsibility of the rector of the president of the university is not only the faculty, it's the faculty's family, their children, their education, their welfare, their housing, everything, their health. It's a very different concept of university. In other words, the education in China is of these minorities, is the holistic concept of everybody's welfare in the family. It doesn't mean that many of the ethnic groups have access to this education. So yes, there are still many people who are deprived. Our record in Mexico is not very good either. As you know, from the time I was working there in Chiapas with the Tzeltal, Tzotzil, and so on, where many of those people in the mountains, when I was working with the Nahuatl in Puebla in the northern part, I mean, year after year we saw people that could not get any monies to try to cultivate the land, that were really excluded. Over a period of 20 years, the militarization of those peasant groups, particularly Nahuatl-speaking groups, is obvious. The difference between those in favor of militarization, those against, was that the first ones became bilingual and could work in the lowlands in Veracruz, and they received weapons coming all the way from Guatemala. And their brothers and sisters that were monolingual in Nahuatl would be next door and would kill each other. Brothers, blood brothers actually, divide over that. There has been a disaster in that area. The neglect of the peasants in Mexico has permitted somewhat the progress of other people, but it still is there. We have in Los Angeles a community of 38,000 Celtal speakers. They were all the way from Chiapas down there. We have about another 14,000 in Colorado. We have about probably 100,000 Nahuatl speakers. We have colonies of Otomis and other Indians used as slaves in camps in California. The growers don't even allow us to come inside to look at them and talk to them. They cannot speak Spanish or anything. They just use them as slaves. It's disastrous. And then part of that happened because they were frustrated and desperate coming all the way north. And of course, South America doesn't have a clean record. The Nazis, that, with the support of the U.S., that found house and found support in Argentina, they continue to be as racist as they were, and same in Brazil and so on. This is a crisis, a historical crossroads in which, for the first time, the intelligentsia of Mexican universities begin to say, enough is enough. You begin to take the leadership and begin to train your teachers with a profound commitment to the language and the cultural rights of the children you work with. And I think that is heroic, and that takes a lot of guts, and that needs to be done. In that context, I think we must point out the stupidity and the inequity of Proposition 187. In that context, we must propose a continued support of revision policies for tests and reinterpretation of them so the tests are not abused and our children are excluded. Let me say a few words. Primero déjeme resumir un poquito de esto y luego voy a la Proposición 187. En este contexto internacional, primero, no es suficiente decir que porque otros países están muy mal, Europa, etc., donde los norafricanos se les excluye, se les persigue, no es suficiente decir que porque en Japón se persigue a los étnicos, etc., que ya todo está bien en Estados Unidos. Naturalmente, Estados Unidos tiene políticas más liberales, pero Estados Unidos tiene una política de indiferencia que está permitiendo que los recursos para los niños inmigrantes, particularmente los niños de color, de habla hispana, que se les excluya y se les deje a un lado. Ese tipo de política de dejar que se les abandone es a la que yo me opongo. Ahora, lo que es reciente y es nuevo es que un señor como Pete Wilson empieza a usar como su ticket, como su political platform, anti-immigrant kind of rhetoric. Eso es nuevo y es esencialmente la carbon copy, una copia de lo que se está haciendo en Europa, que indica una radicalización de la derecha. Y la razón que es más peligrosa es porque Pete Wilson, también como regente de la Universidad de California, está cambiando las políticas internas en que se aceptaban otros criterios para aceptar gente dentro de la universidad. Lo que hace Stanford, por ejemplo, que abre las puertas si la persona tiene experiencia en otras lenguas, en otras culturas, ¿no? That is considered now unacceptable. No se acepta porque se ve como si fuera affirmative action, etc. Bueno, voy a enfatizar un poco la posición esta de la radical de la derecha con la cosa de la Proposición 187. La razón es para hacerles ver a ustedes que su intervención y su posición es tan importante internacionalmente que no la dejen a un lado, porque yo creo que la esperanza está en el grupo como este, en los profesores que tienen una conciencia social y un compromiso con la equidad. First of all, something about the facts of Proposition 187. On November 8, 1994, Californians, including ethnic groups, about half of Hispanics, about 2/3 of the Asians, voted overwhelmingly for Proposition 187, which was looked as a save our state. And the proposition, on many things, says the following. The people of California, the proposition says, have suffered and are suffering economic hardship caused by the presence of illegal aliens in this state. That's how it reads. And it continues, that they have suffered and are suffering personal injury and damage caused by the criminal conduct of illegal aliens in this state. And goes on, that they have a right to the protection of their government from any person or persons entering this country unlawfully. Therefore, based on those premises, therefore, the proposition reads, the people of California declared their intention to provide for cooperation between their agencies of the state and local governments with the federal government and to establish a system of required notification and between such agencies to prevent illegal aliens in the U.S. from receiving benefits or public services in the state of California. That's the bottom line. They wanted to deprive them of these benefits. Okay. Now, in the state of California during the 1980s, you may know, Pete Wilson exemplified they look in the other way, not opposing immigration. In fact, as a senator, he is one of the ones that, talking to the congressional delegation of California, said that they should wait for immigration reform until all of the workers have a chance to help with the harvest crops. So this is a guy that in the 1986 was saying, hey, wait a minute, no, there's no change immigration. Let them stay here long. They need to help us, okay? Cheap labor exploitation, essentially, okay? That's the Wilson also that looked the other way around with his wife was hiring undocumented workers. The phony part of the California argument is that they don't want to say that the increase in minority population of all groups is what is frightening mainstream populations. They don't want to talk about the corruption of the administrators that make people lose billions of dollars, or 20-some billions in one part of California. They don't want to talk about the severe economic recession and the cost of natural disasters. For example, the earthquakes in 1992, between 1992 and 1994, cost California $36 billion. They don't want to talk about the wildfires that cost during that period about $6 million, about the damages that resulted from flood, about $1.6 billion. But they now pick all of that and blame the undocumented immigrants for it. Proposition 187 is not the solution to the problem of control of the border or illegal immigration, as they say. In fact, it has nothing to do with the control of undocumented immigrants. It is a political maneuvering to obtain the presidency. And it's a racist ticket, and it really stinks. I think that in the context of the increase of immigrants from 1940 to about today, we have realized that up to 1940, there was only a small percentage of Hispanics, Latinos coming from the outside, about 18%. Between 1940 and today, it has increased to about 81% of all immigrants coming from Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia. So color immigrants, so to speak, that's what is frightening them. And the ethical questions that the federal government is facing is this. If we take Pete Wilson's advice, the Feds say, if we accept that position, maybe we ought to deny Medicaid, food stamps, welfare to all of the immigrants, undocumented and documented. And the question is, what did these people pay for them? Which they did. Do we have the right to deprive them? The truth is that at the bottom of the argument to destroy Proposition 187, is the fact that the non-documented and the documented immigrants provide so much more money that then use in welfare and in other services. I don't want to stay too long on this, but I just want to tell you that the pseudoscience and the researchers in the universities haven't helped a lot. There's this fellow, my neighbor there in Houston, by the name of Donald Huddle from Rice University, who's been writing about his contention that in the US, in 1992, the government has spent $45 billion more beyond the taxes what the undocumented immigrants paid. That's a nonsense. The Center for Immigration Studies at the University of Houston, led by Nestor Rodriguez, has proved, along with Pascal and others, that the numbers are wrong. In fact, what is happening is that the taxes paid by the undocumented immigrants to the US, the federal government pays in excess of $18 billion never used by anybody, any Hispanics. What is happening is some of the states have lost money because the federal government did not reimburse local governments, and that is where the crisis is. At any rate, the real issue is not so much whether 187 is or is not based on evidences. It was conceived as a political instrument, and it has done a lot of damage. Not only overnight, many people wouldn't go to service and children abandoned schools, but the worst part is that it created clear violence. The evidence we have of this violence is tremendous. There's a lot of recent kind of books on that. Just to give you an idea of the kinds of things, there were gangs in the southern part now between Tijuana and San Diego that would take trips continuously every other night to kill or to shoot at random illegal aliens, as they said, for beer money, to assault them to beer money. There's about 28 cases here. There were victims of violence all over in San Diego County. There were case after case of the other kind of abuses, and I'm not going to get into that, were by the Border Patrol. They committed abuses in Mexican nationals, some cases even killed some of these people because of the roughness of the treatment. And there's case after case. Unfortunately, the courts have not done much with that. What have the Supreme Courts decided about it? Well, the Supreme Courts essentially are saying this. And this is since 1991, a pronouncement in the Filer versus Doe case. The Supreme Court stated that while, and I quote, the state could deny services to individuals who reside illegally in this country, this ruling does not apply to children. Children of illegal entrants should not be punished because of behavior of the parents. And then the court goes on and saying, the Supreme Court states clearly that public education is essential to maintaining our democratic institutions and cultural heritage. Depriving children of it has a high cost. And finally ends up saying, the illegal alien of today may well be the legal alien of tomorrow, which is a very commonsensical, very truthful statement. One other aspect of Proposition 187 that is not discussed often, that shows you how myopic that approach is. In order to implement Proposition 187, the federal government will have to spend about $15 billion, which we don't have. And very likely, it would deprive the very people that the government would need the most. It's as myopic as forcing children to lose their language and culture, and then a few years later invest $2 billion trying to teach diplomats and others Spanish and other languages. Once they lose the language, let's teach them their own language as a second language. You know? It's as myopic as assuming that language and culture have nothing to do with learning. And these people are so gross intellectually that don't understand that even to transition from the home language and culture to understand American society, one needs to anchor concepts and experiences in one's own language. Déjenme traducir un poquito esto antes de llegar a la conclusión. Lo que ha pasado con la posición pública del gobierno y de las autoridades en Estados Unidos es que esta gente burócratas que no tuvieron entrenamiento intelectual suficiente han conceptualizado la nación monolíticamente como una nación en la cual, si usted quiere pertenecer, tiene que dejar de ser lo que sea antes de entrar. Que es muy estúpido, porque en realidad la única manera para hacer una contribución permanente en un país al que uno emigra es poder llevar uno la fuerza de su cultura, de su lengua, de sus tradiciones, para poder hacer una contribución suficiente. Entonces, la actitud del gobierno, y esto desde desde el principio del siglo, ha estado así en favor y en contra. En 1917, por ejemplo, cualquier persona que comenzaba a hablar en otra lengua se le consideraba así como sospechosa. Los pobres alemanes se tenían que esconder, etc. Y eso mismo siguió sucediendo. Pero cuando la población inmigrante empezó a ser de color, entonces ahí se empezaron a preocupar. Y lo que ha habido han querido resucitar una pseudociencia de desarrollo intelectual y psicológico que no existe. La gente en Washington, por ejemplo, tiene ideas tan primitivas sobre el desarrollo humano y la inteligencia que ellos conceptualizan que la inteligencia se puede medir con un instrumento, una lengua distinta, ¿no? Que es una estupidez muy grande. No solo eso, sino que la consideran una ciencia exacta que tiene una base biológica o genética, que quiere decir que usted heredó tanto de inteligencia, se la podemos medir y ya podemos actuar con usted. No entienden ellos, por ejemplo, que un hijo de un japonés que tiene un hermano, a twin brother, un hermano, un cuate, que llega a Estados Unidos, puede ser un científico de primera y acabar en los Álamos, en otro laboratorio de física, y que el hermano que llega aquí 4 o 5 años más tarde, que no puede aprender inglés rápido, lo clasifican como mental retardado mental. No puede entender que cuando uno tiene la misma base genética puede haber diferencias de inteligencia. En realidad, para mí el problema es que se ha conceptuado la inteligencia de una forma muy limitada, un aspecto muy pequeño que es, se lo voy a tener que hacer en inglés porque no puede ser en español. They have conceptualized intelligence essentially to the kind of reasoning that is cognitively understandable, namely very abstract reasoning to make relationships of things. But as you know, those of you who have taken linguistics, any kind of relationship established through language are anchored in the culture. The similarity between objects is not valid across languages. The name might be familiar. Any of the tests that establish scores on the basis of anticipating relationships, this is to this as that is to that other stuff, that is 99% cultural. And not only that, it's socially determined and depends in what particular setting you were socialized. Okay. Essentially, if you're talking about intelligence at the species level, and you accept the fact that we all belong to a single human species, and we must accept that fact, if nothing else, that was the contribution of physical anthropologists in the last 110 years. If we accept that fact, this is what we know. Humans can interbreed, can communicate, they develop abstract language, they transfer knowledge, and intelligence is measured by the ability of these human groups to transfer the knowledge they need to survive and to move on to the next generation. Those individuals that possess more than one linguistic code and more than one cultural code can function more effectively in more than one setting. With 30 million ongoing migrants and immigrants around the world, switching back and forth, trying to find a solution for their lives, the children that need the most understanding, those that have to switch those codes without being asked to do so. They just found themselves in a new setting. And if you have done research in this side of the border in the US, and you see children that are remain quiet, totally almost like como mudos, no, for weeks and so on, you realize they're shocked, and the only cover is to pretend that they don't know the world, they don't deal with it, and they just close the doors. In a study of 40 so-called mentally retarded kids I did in California, in Santa Barbara, all of them ethnics, I realized that there were about 17 high achievers that spoke more than 2 languages, sometimes 3 or 4, that were so intelligent that they could identify math problems in the board, and all of them had one thing in common. They closed eyes and the mind to the world. They didn't want to deal with anybody, and many of them wanted to commit suicide. What have we done to those kids in this society? And how we feel that we can go to sleep peacefully as bureaucrats, administrators, and faculty in the US side by just ignoring their language and culture rights. That is a nonsense, my friends. Let me conclude with a couple of thoughts for you. To assume that because technology, because a very strong economic base, and a very long tradition of scholarship, American universities are going to be able to handle the issue of next century's challenges is not necessarily an acceptable admission. It is very likely that in the next 50 years, the institutions that are going to face the reality of another century, of a multi-ethnic, of a multicultural world, are going to be institutions in which scholars and teachers, like this group here, understand the importance of language and culture and of communication, particularly in the Southwest here in the binational area. Therefore, there is no room for prejudice. We cannot stay in the issue of color, or size, or type of hair. There is no room for pseudoscience. We have to question the validity of certain instruments. There is no room for myopia, for turning our face the other way around. We have to provide the leadership that is not being provided by those institutions that have the power and the money. I have the sense that the research designs that I have seen that begin to develop in the border area are addressing points that nobody is looking at, genuine points about the development issues that cross-cut language and culture. The Southwest belonged to Mexico, and it still belongs to Mexico in a very real sense, because the majority of the people living here are from Mexican culture or from Latin cultures. We cannot indeed turn our face the other way around. We have to give our commitment to those kids, and I'm hoping that we can begin to provide, through collaborative efforts, the kind of leadership that is missing today. For whatever it's worth, my friends, let me tell you that the strength of the Mexican academicians, of people that can communicate in different languages and cultures, is something that has to be now recognized, has to be faced, and has to be respected by everybody around the world. People begin to look up to the Mexican academicians for their studies on binational issues. In Europe, in Germany, the largest groups studying Mexican and Mexican-American studies are right there in a number of universities there with the largest bibliographies and so on. They invest a lot of money there. In the US, there's a beginning recognition that we need to come back south of the border and dialogue with our colleagues and learn from them. This is why this conference was so important. I'll be happy to answer any questions or comments that you may have. Thank you. La primera, la segunda, la tercera, ¿quién más? ¿Alguna cosa que les interese aclarar o preguntar? Lo que yo sé que a veces se escapa mucho porque va uno muy rápido con tanta cosa. Sí, dígame. No, actually, President Clinton has been extremely supportive of education for the minorities. They were not, I was invited twice to the White House, one as a member of a special task force, bilingual aid, and the second time as a member of the task force for the study of the children immigrants. And what I was amazed is that everybody was genuinely involved in the discourse. They wanted to know what was happening with children of immigrants and Hispanic kids. The question is that politically that is not gaining him any point, so to speak. That there is a current of really very strong anti-foreign groups in the country, and that he's not able to provide all the support that he was hoping to provide, financial support for these efforts. But I know philosophically, he's very committed to the education of all children. Yes? That I heard, but the first part, there are some parents or some people. Okay. Yeah, this is a very good question. If I understood the questions, there is some. How do you decide who is on this side, who belongs here versus others? Okay, this is at the guts of the objections against 187. When you have families, generations of families that are commuting across the border, you really have a single family that is fragmented in various places, where even some of the sisters and brothers or the father or the mother may have different status. Some may be documented, some might be undocumented. To me, a decision who belongs where, in the case of children, they belong where they're living and where they're going to school. There is no question that we cannot create out of the schools, offices for immigration to detect who is and who is not legally there. So the whole issue of belonging is there. But there's another reason for recognizing the belonging. When you, for example, in Houston, when you see the Hispanics constructing houses there day and night, sometimes from 6 in the morning to 7 o'clock at night, when you see these people working for years there, do they belong there? Where would we be without the infrastructure of this labor? This is like the Europeans that have not considered European families and generations, 3-4 generations of groups that work there and develop the whole European economy. And the contradiction, I'll pass the floor to you in a minute. The contradiction is this, that we wanted cheap labor, with hand labors. With the hand came an arm and the head and the whole body and the family. And now we say, no, they don't belong here. We wanted cheap labor to compete, but they don't belong here. Could you, you wanted to comment a bit?
Well, yes, I wanted to take you back to the question. The question is basically, who do you think, or do you know those people that are creating these groups against foreign groups consider are native of America?
That's a good question. Those that don't have an accent, that are blue-eyed, blonde, and that essentially have been here for generations. The truth is that many of them do not even know the background of the families, and that for them to become American is to be nobody outside of mainstream American society. The statement by Joshua Fishman that the poorest of all are those that do not know the history, and they want to have everybody else the same. And the truth is that that's very sad. Now, to go to the other side, and with this I'm going to finish, the new movement among so-called closet ethnics is that many of them want to know the backgrounds, European background and so on. And they begin to discover in the past what their ancestors suffered. And for example, the studies in Boston, 1876, they were treated also like animals. In spite of the fact they were European themselves, now they begin to see the importance of looking at new ways of immigrants with compassion and understanding. So what I'm saying is that, yes, I think that the importance of standing up for the rights of language minorities is that it's humanizing and rehumanizing many people. Thank you.
Just a brief announcement. I have copies of the 10 commandments that Dr. Garcia spoke about last night in Spanish. I want to put the copies up.